Welcome to Muslim Apologetics Australia. If you've been following me, we've uploaded a video called Christian Admits Jesus Will Come Back with a Sword. We uploaded that a few days ago, and basically we published it on a blog. Brother Yahya Snow actually published it on his blog. He's also published it on the Speaker's Corner Hyde Park Facebook group. And many of the Christians actually even tagged people like Lizzie. And it's interesting because when we tagged her to respond to the verses I brought up, she was silent. She did not even bother to respond to them, which goes to show that, alhamdulillah, the job's been complete. Lizzie has completely been silenced on that. But of course, other Christians try to come and respond to it. And this is why this is a counter rebuttal and counter response to those Christians. And in particular, his name is Cliff Wilson. We'll quickly run through his questions and we'll give him a rebuttal to that. So if you haven't watched the video called Christian Admits Jesus Will Come Back with a Sword, I'll put a hyperlink below this video. Watch it and study it and understand it. And now we'll go through the counter rebuttal of what Christians have said and then give our counter responses. Basically, Cliff Wilson, he says, now we'll quickly run through his argument. I won't read everything. I'll just paraphrase exactly what his question is and then we'll counter it. He's trying to address the question about Jesus telling his disciples to sell their cloaks and buy swords. And basically he says, you can't blame Peter's actions on Jesus simply because he said, if you do not own a sword, sell your cloak and get one. He quotes, he says, I'm an American. I own guns. I'm not going to use my guns against the authorities who are simply coming to take my friend to jail so that he may face trial. Now, of course, Jesus knew what Peter was going to do and he knew what his own response would be. So here Jesus is making a point. Peter retracts when he tells the believers in Rome to subject themselves to authority. And my counter response to him is, Cliff, you're pretty much spewing rubbish here. Why was it necessary to own swords in Israel? Was Jesus instructing them to use it as a hobby, like target practice? Come on, seriously with this false interpretation. Jesus knew very well that the Romans were after him. In fact, the same disciples didn't leave their swords at home. They were out in public with their swords trying to protect Jesus. In fact, to nail this point home, when we read Luke 22-36, Jesus tells them to go and buy swords. After this verse that came before, we are told in Luke 22:33, in the verses prior, that a disciple said to Jesus that he was either willing to go to prison for Jesus or to die with him. It is thus clear Jesus knew that the disciples would fight dying for Jesus. Jesus then comes back in Luke 22:36 and tells them, go along, buy yourselves swords. So notice what happens. In Luke 22:36, we see Jesus telling them to buy swords. But in the verses prior to that, we see that the disciples were telling Jesus, we will die for you, or we will go to prison for you. This is clear, and it clearly now debunks your assertion that they simply brought swords for reasons other than fighting. He also made the accusation that the disciples don't actually kill for Jesus and so forth. However, this isn't true. In Matthew 19:28, it says, Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on the glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on the 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. We made it clear. We actually made this point in the first video. So as you can see clearly that the disciples of Jesus are judging people and they're judging him to hellfire. In this next question, remember what we said in our video, that Jesus actually told to put down the swords after it cut the Roman soldier's ear off. And he did this because of a tactic of war, because he noticed that he was being outnumbered. He didn't want his disciples to be killed. And the Christian basically wrote in response to this, he said, "As for the tactic of war bit, that's simply nonsense. Jesus had the host of heaven at his disposal. Does this guy not read?" So basically he's saying that, Jesus had God in heaven, to protect him and prolong the wars for him. He didn't need this tactic of war to put down swords. He could have basically fought. And my response to him is, this is interesting. He assumes that Jesus didn't have to fight. He had heaven that can fight for him, or perhaps that is what he's basically trying to say, that heaven will protect him. Well, there is a major problem with this. If we look at the Old Testament wars, it was Yahweh in heaven who collaborated with the earthly beings to fight battles. If we read 1 Samuel 15:3 and Numbers 31, it seems the biblical God didn't just tell them to let God in heaven do the fighting. Rather, they will participate in together. Unless you think Jesus was stuck with the swords, meaning that Jesus himself stuck the swords into babies in 1 Samuel 15:3, who is the God of the Old Testament according to Christians. No, it wasn't. Jesus apparently collaborated with the foot soldiers to go out and murder the Amalekites at that period. So Yahweh connected with the foot soldiers to continue and pursue the fight. So for him to claim that it was, for him to claim that Jesus had heaven at his disposal, he could have used heaven. Well, why didn't he use heaven? He obviously didn't want heaven to be involved. So that's not really an argument, because in even the book of Samuel, heaven wasn't involved again, yet the soldiers fought on. Because why? They were in the numbers. In 1 Samuel 15:3, they had great big numbers. So they pursued, they continued to fight, and they killed the Amalekites. But here, Jesus doesn't have the numbers, so he changed his mind. So basically, that's why. And he didn't depend on God. He didn't obviously want God to get involved, and he let it go. It wasn't time for that, obviously. He didn't want to pursue the jihad like the Amalekites did, like against the Amalekites. And of course, if the Christians want to assert that God brings the judgment, then why do Christians join military forces? 70% of the US Army is made up of Christian soldiers, devout Christian soldiers, according to the Pew Review 2008 Pew Review. Why does Jesus not give the heavenly judgment alone with the Father, yet proclaims that the disciples will be involved in those judgments as well, when we read the passage in Matthew 19:28? Now, here's an interesting point also to consider. In Matthew's Gospel, when we actually read where the disciples drew their swords and cut the Roman soldier's ear off, that's actually not mentioned in the earliest Gospel, in Mark's Gospel. In Mark's Gospel, the same story is actually being narrated, and it says, the men seized Jesus and arrested him. This is in Mark 14:46. Then it says in Mark 14:47, then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Now we go to verse 48, and it doesn't even say, Jesus said, put down your swords, whoever lives by the sword dies by the sword. It says, Jesus instead said, am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? He's talking about the Romans. And again, the verse about put down your swords, whoever lives by the sword dies by the sword, it's not even mentioned in Mark's Gospel, in the earliest narration. Yet now at this moment, we go to Matthew 26:50, And the actual verse is added. Have a look. It says, Jesus replied, "Do what you do with me." Then the man stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Exactly like Mark mentions it. It's similar to that. This is Matthew 26:51. Now look, when we go to the next verse, they add a verse that's not actually mentioned in Mark's gospel. In Matthew it says, "Put your swords back in its place." Jesus said to him, "For all who drew the sword will die by the sword." Now we have a problem here. Was Matthew adding a verse here? It's changed. You can see. I think the comment about the healing not being in Mark is interesting. Has Matthew changed the story? Has Matthew added the bit about who lives by the sword dies by the sword? So you can clearly see that Matthew was adding a narration, an event not even mentioned in Mark's gospel. So it seems that Matthew was trying to promote more of a peaceful Jesus as opposed to what the earlier sources actually narrated. So that's another problem for Christians there. So now we have two problems. We have the problem of Matthew adding a verse that's not found in Mark, trying to promote a peaceful Jesus. Well, why is that narration missing in Mark, since Mark is supposed to also have the account and is supposed to be inspired? Now, if a Christian says, Matthew is giving more of a detailed story, well, one could presume he's just giving more of a made-up story, which is not mentioned in the earliest. And remember, Christians say the earlier the records, the more authentic it is, and yet it's not even there. So that's a problem. That's a problem in its own. And the second problem is that Jesus, even if it is true, Jesus obviously used it as a tactic of war to retreat because he had less numbers. So either way, they get disproven. Now, Cliff comes back and says, and he goes to Muhammad, of course, when he can't refute the points and can't respond, he has to take the Prophet Muhammad. He basically says Prophet Muhammad killed people just because they were unbelievers and so forth. However, this is untrue, as you know, that the Quran and Hadith clearly say that you should keep your truce and treaty with those who resort to peace. Of course, the Prophet Muhammad only fought in the context of wars and so forth. But then again, these same Christians believe that Jesus is the same God as the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, we see that Jesus ordered his soldiers to kill people specifically because they were unbelievers. As I said, when Yahweh Jesus ordered the Amalekites to be killed in 1 Samuel 15:3, the Christian apologists say they were killed because they were sinful people, they were pagans, they were disbelievers, and for that they paid their consequence. They were killed, and in fact their women and children were killed, even their infant babies were killed. So this is the Christian wants to argue with a Muslim and says that Muhammad killed people solely for the reason of disbelief, yet his own Jesus did that. And even Prophet Muhammad's actions can be disputed, yet the Christian God instructed his disciples to do that. And of course, to even add more to this argument, we can bring up Luke 19:27, where Jesus ordered to kill and slay the unbelievers. And of course, Christian apologists say this is a parable, but when we read John Gill's commentary on this, it speaks about Jesus coming in his second coming, and it's a parable that will be a reality. And this is where Jesus will judge the 12 tribes of Israel and send people to hell in the second coming and so forth. So again, we see more of the killing coming. As Lizzie says, as Lizzie quoted in the beginning of the video, that Jesus will come with a sword. So there you have it, folks. This is a clear rebuttal and a response. Thank you for staying in tune. If there are more counter rebuttals and responses upon this, then we'll upload more videos. Thank you.